In today's lesson, we're going to be discussing the Cold War at home. Our essential question is, how did the fear of domestic communism affect American society during the Cold War? So the fear of communism is called the Red Scare. You'll remember that we talked about a first Red Scare following World War I. The Red Scare that plagued America following World War II lasted for a much longer time and had much more significant impacts on American society and culture. So the Red Scare was the fear that communists were trying to destroy America from the inside, that American communists were working to undermine democracy and capitalism. People believed that communists were everywhere, that they were their teachers, their doctors, their politicians, the people making their movies, and that communists were working to overthrow the United States government. So the Red Scare resulted in a lot of hysteria in the United States, a lot of fear of communism, and a lot of distrust among American citizens. So in order to investigate the doings of these American communists, Congress created the House Un-American Activities Committee, also referred to as HUAC. So un-American activities referred to activities that either supported communism or were outright communistic themselves. So HUAC was created by Congress to investigate possible subversive activities in the United States, activities that supported communism. HUAC called before them anyone who was accused or associated with known communists, and they investigated government employees, the armed forces, union members and leaders, educators, scientists, journalists, etc. One group that especially felt the brunt of the Red Scare were people within the movie industry. HUAC conducted a lot of investigations of writers, directors, actors, and this group specifically was called the Hollywood 10. All right, 10 high-profile writers, directors, and producers that refused to answer questions about communist ties. Whenever they were called in before HUAC, they cited their Fifth Amendment rights and refused to testify. The Hollywood 10 were tried, convicted, and sent to prison for refusing to comply with Congress. Anyone who did not agree to talk to HUAC or refuse to answer their questions were often put on a blacklist. We've talked about blacklists before. If your name is on a blacklist, you are not going to get hired. This blacklist specifically impacted the Hollywood community. It was a list of entertainment figures that would not be hired because of expected communist ties. Many people in Hollywood had to start writing under a different name and conceal their identity in order to continue with their careers. And for many of them, their reputations were ruined for all of the 50s. Some of them, their careers were ruined to the point of no return. So the Red Scare was a period of suppressed civil rights in the name of security. Think about some of the events we've talked about thus far. What rights are being violated in the name of security? We can see here by this cartoon that the Committee on Un-American Activities, also HUAC, is interrogating this guy and violating his free speech. I want to remind you that being communist was not and has never been a crime. One of the things that America is prideful of is the right to be part of whatever political party organizations you want to be a part of. However, during this increased fear of communism during the Red Scare, many people who had at one point been part of the Communist Party were treated as criminals. We once again saw free speech being attacked by the Supreme Court in a case that said that communist free speech could be limited because it presented a clear and present danger to the United States. So one of the events that kept the hysteria alive was the case of Alger Hiss. Hiss was a high-ranking government official who had been part of the State Department. He had been instrumental in helping to found the United Nations, and he was a highly respected member of the government. He was accused by a known member of the Communist Party of being a communist himself. In later testimonies, he was accused of committing espionage, spying on behalf of the Soviet Union. His case did draw nationwide attention. He was found guilty, not of espionage, but of perjury, lying under oath. He could not be put on trial for espionage because the event had happened 10 years prior, and the statute of limitations for espionage was only 5 years. But he was found guilty of perjury and sentenced to 2 back-to-back 5-year sentences, total of 10 years in prison, of which he served 3.5. Hiss did claim innocence all his life, and because the allegations and evidence presented against him was so flimsy, we still don't know for sure. Historians go back and forth as to whether Hiss actually was a communist or committed espionage on behalf of the Soviet Union. An important effect of the Hiss case, though, was that it put Richard Nixon, a name that you're all familiar with, in the spotlight. Richard Nixon was very anti-communist. He was part of HUAC and leading those investigations against suspected communists. And he ends up becoming Eisenhower's running mate in 1952, and thus the vice president, because of his anti-communist views. Another case that further increased American sphere of communism was the trial and conviction of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. These were 2 American citizens that were accused and found guilty of giving the Soviet Union information that helped them build the atomic bomb. When they were put on trial, the only evidence against them was the word of one other convicted spy. They were found guilty and given the death penalty. Many claim that it was because of their Jewish heritage that they were so easily found guilty and persecuted. Either way, they were executed in 1953, the first execution of American civilians for treason. Later evidence showed that only Julius was truly involved. He was actually guilty of passing these Soviet secrets. Ethel, his wife, was only minorly involved. The death penalty was probably much too harsh in her case. However, if you remember, if this is sounding like, I've heard this before, the trial of Sacco and Vanzetti during the first Red Scare, this shows a trend of hastily convicting those on flimsy evidence because of this atmosphere of fear. The Red Scare after World War II is almost completely synonymous with the name McCarthy. Senator Joseph McCarthy was one of the leading figures of the Red Scare in the 1950s. This all began whenever he made a speech in early 1950 claiming that he had a list of known communists within the government, specifically within the State Department. He was then called in front of Congress to support these claims that he repeatedly made. While he was in front of Congress, he only was able to produce, he originally said he had the names of 200 and something communist. He was only able to produce 81 files. And even then, like, the evidence he presented was, super vague and flimsy. But Congress called, based off of these claims, they called for a full investigations. Americans definitely trusted Joseph McCarthy. As a whole, Americans listened to his claims. They trusted him. They elevated him to a level of power that he didn't deserve because they were scared. McCarthy began this crusade because he was looking for an issue to get reelected on. Anti-communism was big during this time, so that is the issue that he ran upon. So McCarthy is remembered for producing much of the panic and hysteria during the Red Scare. He was the most powerful politician in the United States between 1950 and 1954. For 4 years, he continued his crusade against communism. A lot of people, a lot of innocent civilians lost their jobs because they were accused by McCarthy. And through the course of his accusations, he ended up accusing former Secretary of State Dean Acheson and George Marshall, the guy who created the Marshall Plan, of being communist within the State Department. So an excerpt from his speech. I have here in my hand a list of 205 people that were known to the Secretary of State as being members of the Communist Party and who nevertheless are still working and shaping the policy of the State Department. His argument was that because these communists had so much influence, that they were deliberately leading the American government down a path to eventual overthrow by communist forces, that they were supporting policies that would give communism the upper hand around the globe. 4 years is a long time for an issue to be constantly in the headlines, for a situation of fear and panic and hysteria. Yet that's how long McCarthy was listened to and believed. He eventually falls from power after he attacks the U.S. Army. He leads televised hearings against members of the military, many who were veterans of World War II. And as Americans watched this, they realized how mean-spirited and false McCarthy's claims and crusade was. This caused him to lose many of his supporters. The Senate formally censured him, which means they basically gave him a slap on the wrist. They officially said that he had done something wrong, and he ended up losing all of his power and influence. McCarthy was also an alcoholic and ended up dying 3 years after. So McCarthy's tactic led to the creation of a new word. McCarthyism refers to accusing people of disloyalty with little to no evidence. This period in American history is often called a witch hunt. Um, some of the similarities to the Salem witch trials: if you were accused of being a communist, you could avoid um, prison time or, damage to your reputation if you gave names of other communists. If you were not just accused, you were actually a communist, like the guy who accused Alger Hiss, he ended up getting no prison time because he cooperated with the US government. Um, so just like the Salem witch trials, you have innocent people being questioned, put on trial, and convicted. Thankfully, most of the victims of the American Red Scare only lost their jobs or their reputation and not actually their lives, like those victims of the Salem witch trials.